Most people know Cadbury as a chocolate bar, a purple wrapper, a glass and a half of milk. But Cadbury was once something far more radical than a confectionery brand. It was an experiment, a Quaker family's attempt to prove that a company could treat its workers like human beings and still turn a profit. They built a factory in a garden. They built a village where no worker paid rent they could not afford. They provided swimming pools, pensions, dental care, and fruit trees in every garden, decades before any government required it. And for a century, it worked. Then, in January 2010, an American food conglomerate bought the whole thing for £11.9 billion, broke its first promise within 7 days, and proved what the Cadbury family had spent 5 generations trying to disprove: that in the end, the market does not care what you believe. Chapter 1. The Shop That Declared War on Gin. In 1824, a 22-year-old Quaker opened a grocer's shop in Birmingham and bet his future on a brown powder nobody wanted. His name was John Cadbury. The shop stood at 93 Bull Street, a narrow Georgian frontage wedged between the soot-stained factories and the gin palaces that were slowly killing the English working class. Birmingham in the 1820s was a city of iron and smoke. 200,000 people lived in its cramped streets, most of them laboring in the metalworks and manufactories that produced buttons, buckles, guns, and jewelry for the British Empire. The building had a bow window. The shelves behind it held tea, coffee, mustard, and a product so unfamiliar to most Birmingham shoppers that John had to explain what it was: cocoa. Ground from beans shipped across the Atlantic, brewed with hot water, bitter, earthy, strange. John was young, earnest, and driven by a conviction that business and morality were not separate pursuits, but the same one. He belonged to the Society of Friends, the Quakers, a religious community whose members dressed plainly, spoke plainly, and believed that every human transaction, commercial or spiritual, should be conducted with absolute honesty. The enemy was alcohol. In the 1820s, gin was cheaper than bread in many English cities. A family could drink itself to death for less than the cost of feeding itself. Workers staggered through factory gates. Children went hungry while their parents sat in tap rooms. Infant mortality in the slums of Birmingham, Manchester, and London ran above 150 per thousand live births. The temperance movement saw alcohol as the root of poverty, disease, and moral collapse. And Quakers like John Cadbury believed they had a duty not merely to preach against it, but to offer something better. Cocoa was that something: hot, bitter, warming. A drink for the working man that did not rob his family or rot his liver. John's first advertisement, placed in the Birmingham Gazette in 1824, offered cocoa nibs prepared by himself, an article affording a most nutritious beverage for breakfast. It was not glamorous. It was not sweet. The cocoa of the 1820s was a gritty, fatty liquid that bore almost no resemblance to the chocolate we know today. But it was not gin. And for a Quaker with a conscience, that was enough. John was not alone in his convictions. He belonged to an extraordinary network. The Quakers of Georgian and Victorian England were shut out of Parliament, barred from the ancient universities, forbidden from holding most public offices. The Test and Corporation Acts demanded Anglican conformity for public life, and Quakers would not conform. So they went into business. They trusted one another. They lent to one another. They married one another's daughters. The Rowntrees made chocolate in York. The Frys made it in Bristol. The Lloyds built a bank. The Barclays built another. The Clarks made shoes in Somerset. an entire class of believers channeled their faith into commerce, and their commerce into reform. A handshake between Quakers was worth more than a contract, because the community would punish dishonesty more severely than any court. John's shop grew, slowly. He moved into manufacturing, producing cocoa and drinking chocolate from a small warehouse in Crooked Lane. He ground the cocoa nibs by hand, using a pestle and mortar on a heated stone slab. By the 1840s, he employed a handful of workers. By 1847, he had taken a larger factory in Bridge Street, and he was displaying his wares at trade exhibitions with the confidence of a man who believed the world would eventually see things his way. But the world was slow. John Cadbury was a better reformer than he was a businessman. He was a city councilor, a campaigner against animal cruelty and the use of climbing boys to sweep chimneys, a man who saw business as a branch of ministry. The cocoa market was crowded. Margins were thin. Competitors cut costs with adulterants that John's conscience would not allow. His health began to fail, worn down by overwork and worry. In 1861, John stepped back. His wife had died. His body was failing. He handed a struggling company to his two sons, Richard, who was 25, and George, who was 22. They inherited a business with 11 employees, shrinking sales, and almost no capital. The factory was losing money. The cocoa was mediocre. The competition was fierce. The brothers considered closing down. Richard, the elder, was cautious by nature. George was quieter, more intense, with an analytical mind that saw problems as puzzles rather than catastrophes. They agreed to give the business 3 years. If it could not be turned around by then, they would walk away and find other work. Nobody would have blamed them for walking away. What they did instead would reshape the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, transform a city, and build one of the most admired companies in the history of British industry. But first, they needed a machine. Chapter 2: Two Brothers and a Borrowed Machine. Richard and George Cadbury inherited a dying company, and the thing that saved it was a Dutch invention their competitors refused to touch. The problem with cocoa in the 1860s was simple. It was terrible. Cocoa beans contain roughly 50% fat in the form of cocoa butter, and early manufacturers had no good way to remove it. The result was a greasy, heavy drink that sat in the stomach like warm mud and left an oily film on the cup. Worse, most manufacturers disguised the poor quality by adding adulterants: brick dust to give it weight, potato starch to thicken it, animal fat to replace the cocoa butter they had partly extracted and sold separately. Some added red iron oxide for color. Others used arrowroot, sago flour, or ground chicory. The cocoa sold to the British public was, in many cases, less than 50% cocoa. Some of it was actively poisonous. The Food Adulteration Act of 1860 had made the worst abuses technically illegal, but enforcement was feeble and the practice continued. Families who thought they were buying a wholesome drink for their children were buying chemical slurry. Into this squalid market came the Van Houten press, invented in the Netherlands in 1828 by Coenraad Johannes van Houten, but slow to reach English factories. The machine squeezed cocoa butter out of the bean under hydraulic pressure, leaving a drier, purer powder that could be dissolved in hot water without turning to sludge. It was not a secret. Anyone could buy one, but most English chocolate makers ignored it because adulterants were cheaper, customers could not tell the difference, and the extracted cocoa butter could be sold at a premium to the cosmetics and pharmaceutical industries. pure cocoa meant smaller profit margins. Richard and George knew the difference. They invested what little capital they had in a Van Houten press, and in 1866 launched a product that would transform the company, Cadbury Cocoa Essence. The product was revolutionary not because of its taste, though it tasted better than anything else on the market, but because of its purity. The brothers took out advertisements in the press. They published the results of independent chemical analyses. They invited The Lancet, the medical journal, to test their product alongside their competitors. Their slogan was devastating in its simplicity: absolutely pure, therefore best. It was marketing, but it was also a moral declaration. In an industry built on deception, the Cadburys were staking their name and their reputation on the claim that their product contained nothing but cocoa. When rival manufacturers were exposed by The Lancet and by the Analytical Sanitary Commission for their adulterations, Cadbury's reputation soared. Customers trusted the name because the name meant something. The purple tin of cocoa essence became a fixture in middle-class kitchens across England. Sales climbed. The workforce grew from dozens to hundreds. George, the quieter and more driven of the two brothers, once confided to a friend that if the firm ever made £1,000 a year in profit, he would retire a happy man. They would make considerably more than that. By the early 1870s, the Bridge Street factory was too small. Orders were outstripping capacity. The workers were crammed into dark, airless rooms, elbow to elbow, surrounded by the noise of machinery and the heavy sweet smell of melting cocoa butter. The brothers needed more space, more workers, more everything. Richard handled much of the sales and administration. George handled the production. Together, they were a formidable team, complementary in temperament and united in purpose. But it was George whose mind kept returning to a question that went beyond the business. He walked through central Birmingham and saw the conditions in which his workers lived. Back-to-back houses with shared outdoor privies, courtyards that never saw sunlight, open sewers running alongside streets where children played, no gardens, no clean air, no green space of any kind. The workers who made Cadbury's pure cocoa went home each evening to environments that were the opposite of pure. They were poisonous. George asked a question that would define his legacy. A question so simple that it should have been obvious, and so radical that almost nobody in Victorian England had ever taken it seriously. If the country was a good place to live, why was it not a good place to work? Chapter 3: The Factory That Grew a Village. George Cadbury asked a question no Victorian industrialist had ever taken seriously. If the country is a good place to live, why not to work? In 1878, the Cadbury brothers bought 14.5 acres of farmland 4 miles south of Birmingham, beside the Bourne Brook in open countryside. They called the site Bournville, adding the French suffix for a touch of elegance in an age when French chocolate was still considered superior to English. It was, at that moment, nothing but fields and hedgerows and a shallow stream bordered by willows. Within a generation, it would become the most famous factory village in the world. The first buildings rose quickly. A new factory, airy and well lit, with large windows that let in natural light and a ventilation system designed to keep the air clean. Around it, open lawns and flower beds. Cricket pitches laid out before the first batch of chocolate was produced. George intended the factory grounds themselves to be a kind of park, a deliberate rejection of the grimy, enclosed workshops that defined Victorian manufacturing. But his ambition went far beyond the factory floor. George began buying surrounding land with his own money not the company's. He was investing his personal wealth, betting everything he had on an idea that most of his peers considered eccentric at best and dangerously socialist at worst. He hired the architect William Alexander Harvey, a man steeped in the arts and crafts tradition of William Morris and John Ruskin, and together they designed something England had never seen, a planned community built entirely around the well-being of the people who would live in it. Harvey's cottages were deliberate acts of beauty. No two were exactly alike. They were built in red brick and half timber, with steep gabled roofs and generous bay windows. Front doors were painted in different colors. Chimneys were ornamental. Each house had a front garden, planted with roses and shrubs, and a large back garden of at least 300 square yards. Every garden had at least 6 fruit trees, apples, pears, plums. The streets were wide and tree-lined, with grass verges separating the pavement from the road. There were parks, playing fields, open spaces. George insisted that no more than 25% of any site could be built upon. The rest was green, air and light and growing things, in a country where most factory workers saw none of these from one week to the next. But the village was more than cottages. The Cadburys provided amenities that most British workers could not have imagined, amenities that most British workers would not receive from any employer or government for another half-century. Swimming pools, heated and open to all employees, men and women alike. Cricket pitches, football grounds, hockey fields, a running track, tennis courts, a large recreation hall for concerts and gatherings, cooking classes for the women, continuation schools for young workers who had left formal education early, offering evening classes in literature, mathematics, French, and woodworking. A pension fund, established decades before the state offered anything comparable. Medical and dental care provided free of charge. Organized day trips to the countryside and the seaside. A works council, established in 1894, that gave employees a genuine voice in the running of the factory. A mechanism for resolving grievances that most Victorian employers would have considered dangerous and absurd. The scale of the enterprise was staggering. By 1900, 313 houses stood across 330 acres of land, with rents set at levels that no worker would struggle to afford. By 1910, the workforce had grown to 5,300 employees. 30% of the company's capital expenditure went not to machinery or marketing, but to worker welfare. The pension fund held £60,000. The factory produced 220 tons of cocoa and chocolate per week. The gardens bloomed. The swimming pools gleamed. The workers played cricket on Saturday afternoons, performed in the company dramatic society, and sang in the choir on Tuesday evenings. George Cadbury was not naive. He knew that what he had built depended on goodwill, and goodwill could be revoked. A future generation of Cadburys might not share his values. A future board might see worker welfare as an expense to be cut. So, in 1900, he took a step that would prove to be the single most important decision in the entire Cadbury saga. He transferred the Bournville estate, by then worth £170,000, to an independent body, the Bournville Village Trust. The trust was legally separate from the company. It had its own board, its own governance, its own purpose, defined in its founding deed, to provide housing for working people in conditions conducive to their health and happiness, with no obligation to maximize financial returns. George gave the village away. He protected it with a structure that no shareholder, no boardroom, no takeover bid could touch. The trust was not a gift to the company, it was a gift to the community. And it was, crucially, a gift with a lock on it. He did not do the same for the company. That distinction between what George protected and what he did not, between the village that was given legal permanence and the business that was left to the mercy of the market, would take 100 years to matter. But when it mattered, it would matter absolutely. For now, though, at the turn of the 20th century, Bournville was a miracle. Journalists came from across Europe to see it. Town planners from Germany and the United States studied its layouts. Politicians cited it in parliamentary debates. A Quaker family had built a factory in a garden and proved that commerce and compassion were not opposites. The dream was real. The chocolate was selling. The workers were thriving. And on an island off the west coast of Africa, 20,000 people were picking Cadbury's cocoa beans in chains. Chapter 4. The chocolate that tasted like slavery. While George Cadbury built swimming pools for his workers in Birmingham, 20,000 laborers picked his cocoa beans in shackles. The island of São Tomé sits in the Gulf of Guinea, a volcanic dot of green roughly 140 miles off the coast of Gabon. Its neighbor, the smaller island of Príncipe, lies 100 miles to the northeast. Together, under Portuguese colonial rule, these islands had become the world's largest cocoa producers by the turn of the 20th century. 230 plantations, called roças, sprawled across their volcanic hillsides. The soil was rich, the rainfall was abundant, the cocoa was superb, and the labor system that produced it was slavery in everything but name. Portugal had officially abolished slavery in its colonies in 1875. The replacement system was called contract labor, or serviços. Under its terms, African workers from Angola and Mozambique were recruited through a process that involved coercion, debt bondage, and outright kidnapping. They were shipped to the islands in conditions that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the Middle Passage and bound to 5-year contracts. They were supposed to be paid. They were supposed to be repatriated when their contracts expired. In practice, no worker was ever sent home. The contracts were signed with thumbprints by people who could not read the documents they were marking. Wages, when they were paid at all, were held in accounts until the end of the contract period, then confiscated on the grounds that the worker had incurred debts for food, housing, and clothing. Families were separated. Children were taken from parents and assigned to different estates. Punishment was brutal: flogging, confinement, deprivation of food. Mortality rates exceeded 10% per year, meaning that the average laborer survived less than a decade on the islands. The workforce had to be constantly replenished with fresh shipments from the mainland. This was not a secret. The system was documented, discussed, and debated in Lisbon. Anti-slavery campaigners in England raised alarms as early as the 1890s. And in the Cadbury archives, there exists a document that crystallizes the horror with the cold precision of commerce. A plantation sale listing from São Tomé that includes, alongside its acreage, its buildings, and its cocoa processing equipment, 200 human beings valued at £3,555. That document sat in a filing cabinet at a company founded by Quakers, a company whose founders had been active members of the Anti-Slavery Society, a company that built its reputation on moral purity. And Cadbury kept buying that cocoa. Year after year after year, 55% of Cadbury's cocoa supply came from São Tomé and Príncipe. The company knew, or could easily have known, the conditions under which it was produced. The question is not whether they knew. The question is what they did about it and how long they took to do it. In 1901, William Cadbury, George's nephew and a director of the firm, received credible reports about conditions on São Tomé. He began what would become known as his quiet diplomacy. He wrote to the Portuguese government. He sent agents to investigate. He corresponded with planters. He attended meetings in London and Lisbon. He consulted with the Foreign Office. He was, by all accounts, genuinely distressed by what he learned. He was also, by all accounts, in no hurry to act on it. The journalist Henry Wood Nevinson had no such patience. In 1904 and 1905, Nevinson traveled to Angola and São Tomé on assignment for Harper's Monthly magazine. What he found was systematic enslavement on an industrial scale. Workers bought and sold in open markets in Angola. Coffles of laborers chained together and marched hundreds of miles to the coast. Children separated from mothers. Men and women worked to exhaustion on plantations and buried in unmarked graves when they collapsed. Nevinson published his findings in a series of articles and then in a landmark book, A Modern Slavery, that left no room for ambiguity. He named the system for what it was. He named the companies that profited from it, and he named Cadbury. William Cadbury's response was to continue his diplomacy. He traveled to São Tomé himself in 1908, accompanied by Joseph Burt, the investigator the company had hired in 1905. He returned with a detailed report confirming everything Nevinson had written. He pressed the Portuguese government for reforms. He corresponded with other chocolate manufacturers, including Rowntree and Fry, urging them to join a coordinated response. And throughout all of this, for 7 full years after the first reports reached him, Cadbury continued to buy São Tomé cocoa. Every shipment that arrived at the docks in Liverpool and was transported to the factory at Bournville contained the labor of people who would never be free. The scale of the complicity is measured in human lives. Between 20,000 and 40,000 forced laborers worked the island's plantations during this period. Not a single laborer was ever repatriated under the contract system. The mortality rate meant that the labor force was, in effect, being consumed and replaced on a continuous cycle, a machine that devoured human beings and produced cocoa beans. The economics were stark. São Tomé cocoa was cheap because São Tomé labor was free. Switching to another source would have increased Cadbury's costs. It would have disrupted supply chains. It would have required investment in new supplier relationships. The commercial incentive to delay was powerful, even if it was never openly acknowledged. The numbers tell one story. Between 1900 and 1909, Cadbury purchased thousands of tons of São Tomé cocoa. The company's profits grew. Its workers in Bournville lived in comfort that their counterparts on São Tomé could not have imagined. Two realities existed simultaneously: the model village and the slave plantation, connected by a supply chain and separated by an ocean. The question of whether William Cadbury's 7 years of quiet diplomacy represented principled patience or commercial convenience has never been satisfactorily resolved. What is beyond dispute is this: a Quaker company that had built its entire identity on moral purity was buying cocoa produced by enslaved people, and it took nearly a decade for it to stop. The reckoning, when it came, would be public, humiliating, and compressed into a single coin worth a quarter of a penny. Chapter 5. 1 farthing of conscience. George Cadbury sued a newspaper for calling him a slaver, and the jury told him exactly what they thought of his defense. In September 1908, the Evening Standard published an article that described the Cadbury family as hypocrites. The charge was blunt. The Cadburys preached morality while profiting from slave labor. They campaigned against forced labor in the Belgian Congo through their newspaper, the Daily News, while their own chocolate was produced with beans picked by enslaved Africans. George Cadbury, the builder of Bournville, the champion of the worker, was presented as a man whose principles stopped precisely where his profit margins began. The Cadburys sued for libel. It was a decision that would backfire spectacularly. The case came before a jury at the Birmingham Assizes in December 1909. It was one of the most closely watched trials of its era. The courtroom was packed, and the cross-examination that followed would become one of the most devastating in British legal history. Edward Carson, the barrister representing the Evening Standard, was among the finest advocates of his generation. An Irishman of fierce intelligence, Carson had destroyed Oscar Wilde in court 14 years earlier. Now he turned his attention to William Cadbury, who appeared as the principal witness for the family. Carson's method was surgical. He did not accuse. He did not raise his voice. He established facts. He built a timeline piece by piece, and he let the timeline speak for itself. It was the technique of a man who understood that the most devastating cross-examination is one where the witness convicts himself through his own testimony. When had William Cadbury first learned of conditions on São Tomé? 1901. When had he written his first letter to the Portuguese authorities expressing concern? Some months later. When had he hired an investigator, Joseph Burt, to visit the islands? 1905. When had Burt reported back with his findings? 1907. When had William visited the islands himself? 1908. And when, during all of those years, all of those letters, all of those meetings, all of those expressions of concern, had Cadbury stopped buying São Tomé cocoa? The answer was never, not until March 1909. 7 full years of quiet diplomacy, and the purchases had continued throughout every one of them. Carson pressed. How many laborers had worked the São Tomé plantations during those 7 years? William could not give a precise figure. Estimates ranged from 20,000 to 40,000 at any given time. How many had died? William did not know. The mortality rate exceeded 10% per year. How many had been repatriated to their homelands? None, not one. How many tons of cocoa had Cadbury purchased from those plantations? William admitted to thousands. William's defense was that precipitous action would have accomplished nothing, that a boycott without reform would simply have driven the trade to other buyers who had no conscience at all. These were not unreasonable arguments. They were also arguments that had served the company's commercial interests perfectly for 7 years. The jury's verdict was technically in Cadbury's favor. The Evening Standard had indeed published defamatory material, but the damages awarded were 1 farthing, a quarter of a penny, the smallest coin in the realm. It was a legal victory that functioned as a moral indictment. The jury was saying, in the most British way possible, that the Cadburys were right about the law and wrong about everything else. The delayed boycott had finally come in March 1909. Cadbury announced it would no longer purchase São Tomé cocoa. The company switched its supply to the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana. William Cadbury later published a book, Labor in Portuguese West Africa, defending the family's conduct. It is a careful, thorough, and deeply uncomfortable document. It reads like a man trying to prove that good intentions excuse slow action. The São Tomé scandal left a permanent stain, not because the family were villains. George Cadbury's commitment to social reform was genuine, documented in brick and mortar across Bournville. William's distress was real, visible in his letters and testified to by colleagues and friends. But the scandal revealed the fundamental weakness at the heart of Quaker capitalism. A system built on personal morality cannot guarantee moral outcomes when the supply chain extends beyond the reach of personal relationships. You can be a good person and still profit from evil if the evil is far enough away and the profit is close enough at hand. George could walk through Bournville and see his values reflected in every cottage, every garden, every swimming pool. He could shake the hands of his workers. He could watch their children play on the cricket pitch. He could know, with the certainty of daily witness, that his business was doing good. He could not walk through Saint-Thomé. The plantation was 4,000 miles away, hidden behind an ocean, a colonial government, a foreign language, and a web of commercial intermediaries. The company that built its reputation on purity was purchasing the products of cruelty, and the delay in addressing it was measured not in weeks or months, but in years and human lives. The Farthing verdict hangs over the Cadbury story like a question that never quite resolves. Were 7 years of diplomacy principled patience or commercial convenience? The answer depends on whether you follow the money or the letters. Both are true. Neither is complete. What the scandal proved, above all, was that good intentions are not a governance structure. The Cadbury's ethics were personal, they were sincere, and they were, when tested against distance and complexity and profit, insufficient. A harder lesson was coming. It would take another century, and it would have nothing to do with cocoa beans. It would be about shares. Chapter 6. The merger that replaced the soul. Nobody noticed the moment Cadbury stopped being a Quaker company and became an ordinary corporation, because it happened so gradually it felt like progress. George Cadbury died in 1922 at the age of 83. He had lived long enough to see Bournville grow into a thriving community of thousands. He had lived long enough to weather the Saint-Thomé scandal. He had not lived long enough to see the slow, structural erosion of everything he had built inside the company itself. The first merger came in 1919, 3 years before George's death. Cadbury merged with J.S. Fry and Sons, the Bristol chocolate maker that had been producing confectionery since 1761. The logic was commercial: combined purchasing power, shared distribution, economies of scale. The Frys were Quakers too. The cultures were compatible. The merger felt natural, but it established a precedent. Cadbury was no longer a single family's enterprise. It was becoming something larger, more complex, and harder to steer by conscience alone. For decades after the Fry merger, the Cadbury ethos held. The company continued to invest in worker welfare. Cadbury Dairy Milk, launched in 1905, became the best-selling chocolate bar in Britain. The family maintained significant influence, though the shareholding gradually broadened. Cadbury was still, in the public imagination, the good company, the chocolate company with a soul. Then came 1969. Cadbury merged with Schweppes, the drinks manufacturer. Schweppes made tonic water, ginger ale, and lemonade. It was a respectable company with a long history, tracing its roots back to 1783, but it was not a Quaker firm. It did not share Cadbury's founding values. It did not have a Bournville. It did not have a tradition of worker welfare or community investment. The rationale for the merger was scale and diversification. The soft drinks market was growing rapidly. The confectionery market was intensely competitive. Together, Cadbury Schweppes would have the size and diversity to compete internationally against American giants like Mars and Hershey. But the Schweppes merger changed the company's center of gravity in ways that were not immediately visible, but would prove irreversible. The boardroom dynamics shifted. Decision-making moved from the old Quaker model of consensus and moral deliberation to the harder calculus of shareholder returns and quarterly earnings. The men who ran Cadbury Schweppes were professional managers, competent and often brilliant, but their loyalties ran to the share price, not to the memory of George Cadbury's fruit trees. The market was not gentle. By the 1970s, Cadbury Schweppes faced brutal competition on every front. Rowntree McIntosh launched the Yorkie bar in 1976, a chunky, masculine competitor positioned as a direct rival to dairy milk. Mars was aggressive and well-funded. Nestlé was expanding rapidly through acquisitions. Own-label chocolate from supermarkets was eating into margins at the value end of the market. Cadbury's market share in the United Kingdom fell to 20%, a figure that would have horrified the company's mid-century leadership. The product range had ballooned to 78 lines, many of them tired, unprofitable, and cannibalizing each other. Management conducted a ruthless audit and was forced to slash the range to 33 lines, killing products that had been in production for decades. The company survived. It adapted. It invested heavily in marketing. It modernized its factories. It expanded internationally, building strong positions in India, Australia, and South Africa. But each adaptation, each restructuring, each efficiency drive took it further from its origins. The decisions being made in the boardroom were not wrong by commercial standards. They were rational, strategic, and sometimes necessary. They were also, slowly and irreversibly, replacing the culture that had made Cadbury exceptional with a culture indistinguishable from any other consumer goods corporation. The critical moment came in two stages. In 2007, Cadbury Schweppes announced that it would close the Somerdale factory in Keynsham, near Bristol, and move production to Poland. Somerdale had been making chocolate since 1935. 500 workers faced redundancy. The decision was made on cost grounds. It was, in the language of corporate strategy, a restructuring. In the language of the workers, it was a betrayal. Then, in 2008, the final structural transformation. Cadbury demerged from Schweppes, splitting the drinks business from the confectionery business. The goal was to create a focused, standalone chocolate company. What it actually created was a target. A demerged Cadbury was smaller, simpler, and easier to value. It had no diversified portfolio to complicate a bid. It had a strong brand, predictable revenues, and a share price that reflected the market's assessment of its standalone worth. It was, in the terminology of corporate finance, in play. The family was no longer in control. Quaker governance was a memory. The company was publicly listed, widely held, and governed by the same rules that governed every other corporation on the London Stock Exchange. Those rules said that if someone offered enough money, the shareholders would decide. Not the workers, not the community, not the heirs of George Cadbury, the shareholders. By late 2008, Cadbury was a company stripped of family control, stripped of structural protection, floating in open water. It would not take long for the predator to arrive. Chapter 7. The Bid Nobody Wanted. On the 28th of August, 2009, Irene Rosenfeld offered £10.2 billion for a company that did not want to be sold. Rosenfeld was the chief executive of Kraft Foods, the American food conglomerate headquartered in Northfield, Illinois. Kraft was the second largest food company in the world, with revenues exceeding $40 billion and operations in more than 70 countries. It made processed cheese slices, Oscar Mayer hot dogs, Kool-Aid, Jell-O, and Maxwell House coffee. It was enormous, unglamorous, and relentlessly profit-focused. Its corporate culture was built on margin extraction, cost reduction, and the ruthless optimization of supply chains. It was, in almost every respect, the opposite of what Cadbury had once been. And now it wanted to swallow Cadbury whole. The opening bid valued Cadbury at 745 pence per share. Roger Carr, the chairman of Cadbury's board, rejected it within hours. He called it derisory. Todd Stitzer, the chief executive, called it an insult to the company's heritage and its prospects. Together, they launched a public campaign that was part corporate defense, part national appeal, and part plea to the conscience of anyone who still believed that some things should not be for sale. Don't let Kraft steal your company. The line resonated because it touched something deeper than corporate strategy. The British press rallied. Editorial pages that normally cared nothing about mergers and acquisitions were suddenly eloquent about heritage and identity. Cadbury was not just another corporation. It was a national institution. The company that sent chocolate to soldiers in the Boer War and both World Wars, packed in tins stamped with the royal crest. The company whose purple wrapper was as familiar as the Royal Mail's pillar box. The company whose advertisements, from the milk tray man to the drumming gorilla, had lodged themselves in the national memory. The idea of an American processed food company, a company that made Cheese Whiz and Tang, swallowing it whole, provoked something close to national grief. The backlash was extraordinary. Trade unions warned of catastrophe. Unite, the largest union representing Cadbury workers, predicted up to 7,000 job losses if the takeover succeeded. The GMB union called it a potential disaster for British manufacturing. Parliamentary committees convened urgent hearings. The business secretary, Lord Mandelson, expressed public concern and hinted at possible government intervention. Felicity Loudon, George Cadbury's great-granddaughter, went public with her opposition. "My great-grandfather would have been horrified," she told reporters. The Daily Telegraph ran a reader poll. 70% of respondents opposed the takeover. A petition gathered tens of thousands of signatures. Workers at Bournville wore protest badges on their overalls, but none of it mattered. None of it could matter, because the people who would decide Cadbury's fate were not its workers, its managers, its host communities, or the British public. They were its shareholders. And an increasing number of those shareholders had only one question: how much? Kraft raised its bid. Analysts speculated about the final price. Cadbury's share price climbed steadily as traders priced in a higher offer. The gap between the company's standalone value and the expected takeover premium created an irresistible opportunity for a particular kind of investor. The short-term fund that buys into a target company not because it believes in the business, not because it wants to own chocolate factories or preserve factory villages, but because it expects to flip the shares at a profit when the deal closes. These funds began accumulating Cadbury stock in large quantities. They arrived from New York, from Connecticut, from the City of London, armed with algorithms and spreadsheets and no sentiment whatsoever. They did not care about Bournville. They did not care about heritage. They did not care about the 5 generations of Cadburys who had built the business from a single shop on Bull Street. They did not care about the 400 workers at Summerdale, or the £60,000 pension fund that George Cadbury had established over a century earlier. They cared about the spread between the current share price and the final offer. That spread was their entire reason for being there. Roger Carr knew what was happening. He had spent his career in corporate life. He understood the mechanics of a hostile bid better than most. But understanding the mechanics and being able to stop them are very different things. Under British takeover rules, the decision rested with whoever held the shares at the moment of the vote. There was no cooling off period. There was no loyalty test. There was no requirement that shareholders demonstrate any long-term commitment to the company. There was no mechanism to distinguish between an investor who had held Cadbury shares for 30 years and a hedge fund that had owned them for a fortnight. Kraft raised its offer again, 800 pence per share, then 840 pence. The final bid valued Cadbury at £11.9 billion. Carr's board continued to recommend rejection. The trade unions pleaded. The politicians protested. The newspapers editorialized. And somewhere, in a trading room in New York or Chicago or London, a fund manager looked at a screen, calculated the premium over the current market price, and placed an order. The vote was coming. And the people who would cast the deciding ballots had no loyalty to the company, no knowledge of its history, and no interest in its future beyond the next few days. Chapter 8, 30% of nothing. The hedge funds that decided Cadbury's fate had owned their shares for weeks, held no loyalty to its workers, and wanted exactly one thing. In the weeks before the final vote on the Kraft takeover, Cadbury's share register underwent a transformation that should have alarmed everyone, but surprised no one who understood the market for corporate control. Short-term investors, hedge funds, merger arbitrageurs, and event-driven traders accumulated roughly 30% of the company's outstanding shares. They had bought in specifically because of the takeover bid. They had no interest in Cadbury as a going concern. They wanted the deal to close because the deal closing was how they made money. This is not illegal. It is not even unusual. It is the ordinary functioning of the market. A takeover bid is announced. The target's share price rises toward the expected offer. Traders who believe the deal will complete buy shares at the current price and plan to tender them at the higher takeover price. The difference is their profit. The more shares they accumulate, the more likely the deal is to succeed, because they will vote in favor of any offer that exceeds their purchase price. The system is self-reinforcing. The result is a structural bias that sits at the heart of every contested acquisition. The people who decide whether a company should be sold are disproportionately people who have already bet that it will be. Long-term shareholders, the pension funds and institutional investors who held Cadbury stock for years and might have resisted, are diluted by short-term holders who want the premium and nothing else. Roger Carr understood this with painful clarity. After the takeover, he delivered a lecture at the Said Business School at Oxford, in which he laid out the structural failure in forensic detail. He described how transient shareholders, people with no stake in the company beyond a few weeks of ownership, overrode the interests of employees, communities, and long-term investors. He described how the board, despite unanimous opposition to the bid, was powerless to resist. The irony was crushing. The Cadbury Report of 1992, one of the most influential documents in the history of British corporate governance, had been authored by Sir Adrian Cadbury, a former chairman of the company. Sir Adrian was the great-grandson of John Cadbury, the man who had opened the shop on Bull Street. His report established the principles of board accountability, transparency, non-executive oversight, and shareholder rights that governed every publicly listed company in the United Kingdom. It was studied in business schools around the world. It was the foundation of the combined code on corporate governance. It was designed to protect shareholders and ensure that boards acted in their interests. It was not designed to protect companies from their shareholders. Sir Adrian's report assumed, reasonably for its time, that shareholders were broadly long-term investors with a genuine interest in the companies they owned, that they would weigh the long-term health of a business against the short-term premium of a takeover bid, that they would consider factors beyond the immediate share price, the welfare of employees, the interests of communities, the preservation of brands and cultures that had been built over generations. By 2009, the market had evolved far beyond that assumption. Share ownership had become fragmented, transient, and detached from the underlying business. Shares were held for months, weeks, sometimes days. A significant portion of Cadbury's register consisted of investors who had never bought a bar of dairy milk, never visited Bournville, never read the founding deed of the Bournville Village Trust, and would sell their shares the instant the deal was completed. The company that gave Britain its corporate governance code was destroyed by the code's blind spots. The family that wrote the rules discovered that the rules could not protect the thing the family had built. Other countries had defenses. In the Netherlands, companies could issue poison pill shares. In France, long-term shareholders could be granted double voting rights. In the United States, staggered boards and dual-class share structures gave founders and families the ability to resist hostile bids. Britain had none of these mechanisms. The takeover panel, the regulator that oversaw contested acquisitions, operated on the principle that shareholders should decide, and shareholders in the panel's framework meant whoever held the shares at the moment of the vote, regardless of how long they had held them or why they had bought them. The vote took place on the 2nd of February, 2010. Kraft's final offer stood at 840 pence per share, a premium of roughly 50% over the pre-bid price. The mathematics were simple and brutal. The short-term holders voted yes, overwhelmingly. Enough long-term holders, tempted by the premium or despairing of resistance, accepted the offer to push the total over the threshold. Cadbury's 186-year history as an independent company ended with a shareholder vote dominated by people who had owned their stake for less time than it takes to age a wheel of cheddar. £11.9 billion. That was the price. The market had spoken. The shareholders had decided. The system had functioned precisely as designed. The system had also destroyed a company that 6 generations of a family, thousands of workers, and an entire community had spent nearly 2 centuries building. But the system was not designed to care about that. It was designed to allocate capital efficiently, and it had. Within hours, the dismantling began. Chapter 9. 7 days to break a promise. Kraft had pledged to keep the Somerdale factory open, and it took exactly 1 week after gaining control to reverse that promise. During the takeover battle, Irene Rosenfeld had made a series of public assurances designed to ease the concerns of workers, politicians, and the British public. Chief among them was the commitment that Kraft would keep open the Somerdale factory in Keynsham, near Bristol, which Cadbury itself had announced it would close in 2007. Somerdale employed around 400 people. It had been making chocolate since 1935. Generations of families in Keynsham had worked there. The factory's closure under Cadbury's own plans had been controversial enough. Kraft's promise to reverse that decision was a strategic masterstroke designed to neutralize union opposition, reassure wavering shareholders, and give politicians a reason to step back from active intervention. Kraft used the Somerdale promise in its public statements, in the materials it circulated to institutional investors, and in its representations to government ministers. 7 days after the deal closed, Kraft reversed the commitment. Summerdale would close after all. Production would move to Poland, exactly as Cadbury had originally planned. 400 workers, many of whom had spent their entire careers at the factory, whose parents, and in some cases grandparents, had worked there before them, were told their jobs were gone. The machines that had poured chocolate for 75 years would fall silent. The reaction was fury, controlled, parliamentary, very British fury, but fury nonetheless. Members of Parliament demanded an explanation. The House of Commons Business, Innovation and Skills Select Committee launched a formal inquiry into the takeover and its aftermath. Liam Byrne, the Labour Minister, called the reversal irresponsible and unwise. The committee's report went further. It described Kraft's behavior during the takeover as irresponsible and concluded that the Summerdale promise had been made either without adequate due diligence into the costs of keeping the factory open or as a deliberate tactic to smooth the acquisition with no genuine intention of honoring it. The committee did not determine which interpretation was correct. Both were damning. Irene Rosenfeld was invited to appear before the committee to answer questions about the broken promise and the future of Cadbury's UK operations. She declined. She sent Mark Firestone, Kraft's general counsel, in her place. The refusal to face parliamentary scrutiny became, in the British press and in the court of public opinion, a symbol of corporate arrogance on an extraordinary scale. Here was the chief executive of the company that had just swallowed one of Britain's most beloved brands, a company that had been part of the national fabric for nearly 2 centuries, and she would not even cross the Atlantic to answer questions about her first broken promise. The committee noted her absence in its report. The press savaged it for weeks. Inside the company, the transformation was immediate and comprehensive. Cadbury's entire senior leadership team, the executives who had fought the takeover and lost, resigned or was replaced within hours of the deal closing. Todd Stitzer, who had led the defense, left immediately. The culture that had defined the company, however attenuated and corporatized it had become in its final decades, was swept away overnight. Kraft did not want Cadbury's management philosophy. It did not want Cadbury's processes or traditions or institutional memory. It wanted Cadbury's brands, Cadbury's distribution network, Cadbury's market position, and Cadbury's cash flows. Everything else was overhead. The numbers tell the story of dissolution with brutal clarity. £11.9 billion paid for the acquisition. 400 jobs eliminated at Summerdale within months. 6,000 UK-based workers left in a state of uncertainty about their futures as Kraft began its integration program. 45,000 employees worldwide absorbed into a corporate structure that would soon be renamed Mondelez International, a word coined by a naming committee through an employee competition, a word that means nothing in any language, and was chosen, presumably, for precisely that emptiness. Rosenfeld received a 40% pay rise the year after the takeover. Her total compensation reached $17 million. The workers at Summerdale received statutory redundancy packages and directions to the job center. The parliamentary inquiry produced a report. The report produced recommendations. The recommendations produced modest reforms to the takeover code, including a requirement that bidders must formally state their intentions regarding the target company's employees, factories, and pension commitments, and that any statements made during a bid should be held to for a period of 12 months. But the core mechanism, the ability of short-term shareholders to sell a company against the wishes of its workers, its community, its board, and the overwhelming majority of the British public remained entirely untouched. No one in government proposed changing it. No one in the city wanted it changed. The system protected itself. Roger Carr, reflecting on the experience, was blunt. The system worked exactly as it was supposed to. The problem was that the system was not designed to produce outcomes that any reasonable person would call just. It was designed to produce outcomes that were efficient. And in the grammar of market efficiency, a 186-year-old company, a village, a tradition, and 400 jobs were simply inputs to be allocated wherever the return was highest. The Cadbury family had spent 5 generations building a company on the belief that business should serve a purpose beyond profit. Kraft had demonstrated in 7 days that the market disagreed. What remained was rubble and a question. Was there anything left to save? Chapter 10. What the trust saved and the market destroyed. The Bournville Village Trust, established in 1900, still houses 23,000 people, and it has never answered to a single shareholder. Drive through Bournville today, and you will see William Alexander Harvey's cottages still standing. The red brick, darkened by a century of English weather, but solid and well-maintained. The steep gables, the bay windows, the fruit trees, pruned and blossoming in spring. The streets are clean and tree-lined. The gardens are tended. The playing fields are still played on. The alcohol ban that George Cadbury imposed more than 120 years ago is still in force. There is no pub in Bournville. There is no off-license. There is a chocolate factory still operating, though its owner's name now means something different than it did. The Bournville Village Trust manages more than 1,000 acres. It provides housing for over 23,000 residents across 8,000 properties. It maintains parks, community centers, and nature reserves. It operates for the benefit of its community, not for the maximization of shareholder returns. The Trust's founding deed states its purpose. That purpose has not changed in more than a century. The Trust survived the Kraft takeover because it was never part of the company. George Cadbury separated the village from the business in 1900, and that separation proved to be the most consequential decision he ever made. When Kraft bought Cadbury in 2010, it bought the brand, the factories, the recipes, the distribution networks, and the workforce. It did not buy the village. It could not. The trust was independent. Its governance was its own. Its purpose was written into its legal structure, not entrusted to the goodwill of whichever corporation happened to own the factory next door. Walk down the streets that Harvey designed, and you can still feel the intention behind them. The houses were built to human proportions, not to maximize return on land. The gardens were sized for growing food, not for show. The open spaces were planned for recreation, not left over from the building process. Every design choice reflected a belief that the people who lived here deserved beauty, comfort, and dignity. That belief is still visible in the brickwork, still audible in the birdsong from the trees that George Cadbury planted, still tangible in the community that gathers in the halls and parks he endowed. The Trust's conservation protections ensure that Harvey's original cottages cannot be demolished or substantially altered without approval. New developments within the Trust's boundaries must meet design standards that respect the character of the original village. The alcohol ban, which many predicted would be overturned within a generation, has survived for over 120 years. It has outlasted 2 world wars, the sexual revolution, the Thatcher era, and the company that created it. The contrast between the Trust and the company is the central lesson of the Cadbury story. Both were created by the same family, in the same era, driven by the same values, funded by the same fortune. One was given a governance structure that made its purpose permanent and protected it from the market. The other was given a governance structure that left its purpose vulnerable to whoever happened to hold the shares on any given Tuesday. The village endures. The company, as the Cadburys knew it, does not. This is not a sentimental point. It is a structural one. The trust works not because the people who run it today are better or more virtuous than the people who run Mondelez. It works because it was designed to work. Its purpose is encoded in its governance, locked into its founding deed, protected by its legal structure. It cannot be sold to the highest bidder. It cannot be stripped for parts and shipped to Poland. It cannot be sacrificed to a quarterly earnings target or a chief executive's bonus scheme. George Cadbury built two things, a company and a community. He protected one of them with a lock that no shareholder could pick. The other he left to the market. The market did what markets do. Chapter 11. The Shrinking Bar and the Vanishing Crown. After 170 years, the royal warrant was revoked, and the chocolate itself had already become something the founders would not have recognized. Under Mondelez ownership, Cadbury's products underwent changes that, taken individually, seemed minor. Taken together, they amounted to a quiet demolition of everything the brand had stood for. The most visible change was shrinkflation. Bars got smaller, prices stayed the same or rose. The classic dairy milk bar shrank from 200 grams to 180, then to 160. Multi-packs contained fewer bars for the same price. The Toblerone lost two of its peaks, its distinctive triangular silhouette suddenly gap-toothed and diminished. The Freddo, a small chocolate frog beloved by British children and used by generations of parents as pocket money currency, became a national barometer of inflation and corporate greed. Its price rose from 10 pence in 2000 to 30 pence by 2020, a 300% increase that outpaced wages, inflation, and housing costs alike. Consumers noticed. They complained on social media and in the letters pages of newspapers. They made memes. They signed petitions. They bought the chocolate anyway, because what else was there? The creme egg was more dramatic. In 2015, Mondelez changed the recipe of the iconic Easter treat, replacing the dairy milk chocolate shell with a cheaper compound chocolate made with vegetable fat rather than cocoa butter. The dairy milk shell had been the cream egg's entire promise, real chocolate surrounding the fondant filling. The switch saved money per unit, but destroyed the product's identity. The backlash was immediate, vocal, and commercially devastating. An estimated £6 million in lost sales within a single year. The company initially denied that the recipe had changed. Then it acknowledged the change while insisting the taste was comparable. Consumers disagreed, loudly and persistently. The creme egg debacle became a textbook case study in what happens when a brand's custodian values cost savings over the product that built the brand's reputation. Then came the fair trade decision. Cadbury had been one of the first major chocolate companies to adopt fair trade certification for its dairy milk bars, a commitment made in 2009, just months before the Kraft takeover. The fair trade mark meant independent verification that cocoa farmers received a guaranteed minimum price for their beans, along with a premium for community investment in schools, clinics, and infrastructure. It was a meaningful, visible commitment to ethical sourcing, and it connected the modern company, however tenuously, to the values of its founders. Under Mondelez, the fair trade certification was replaced in 2016 with the company's own proprietary sustainability program, Cocoa Life. Mondelez argued that Cocoa Life invested more money directly in cocoa-growing communities than Fairtrade's structure could provide. Critics argued that replacing an independent, externally audited certification with a company-controlled program eliminated the one thing certification was supposed to provide: accountability that does not depend on the company marking its own homework. The fox was now guarding the henhouse and asking to be trusted. The final symbolic blow came in December 2024. King Charles revoked Cadbury's royal warrant, a mark of royal approval the brand had held since the reign of Queen Victoria. The warrant was simply not renewed. The symbolism was unmistakable. The chocolate that had once been good enough for the Queen was no longer good enough for the King. Not everything was lost. James Cadbury, the great-great-great-grandson of John Cadbury, launched Love Cocoa with 10% of profits going to charity. It is a small company. It makes good chocolate. It is an echo of the original impulse, a Cadbury who believes that business should do more than extract profit. But Love Cocoa is not Cadbury. It does not command the market share or the structural power that the original company once held. It is a ghost of an ethos surviving in fragments. The Cadbury name still appears on billions of chocolate bars sold in dozens of countries. The purple wrapper still lines every supermarket shelf. But the name now belongs to a corporation that also makes Tang and Oreos. What it means has changed. What it represents has changed. What it tastes like has changed. The founders, who ground their own cocoa nibs by hand and stamped their tins with absolutely pure, therefore best, would not recognize the product or the company that bears their name. Chapter 12. The gift that could always be taken back. The Cadbury family proved that ethical capitalism could work for a century, and then they proved something far more important, that it cannot last. This is not a story about good people losing to bad people. Irene Rosenfeld was not a villain. She was a chief executive doing what chief executives are hired and incentivized and legally obligated to do: maximize returns for shareholders. She ran a food company. She found a target that was undervalued, underleveraged, and underprotected. She made a bid. She won. The hedge funds that bought Cadbury stock were not evil. They were doing what traders do, identifying a profit opportunity and exploiting it with speed and precision. Even the politicians who convened inquiries and expressed their deep concern and promised that lessons would be learned were not hypocrites, exactly. They were operating within a system they had helped construct, or at least declined to reform, and had no real intention of dismantling. Everyone was playing their role. The system wrote the script. The individuals merely delivered their lines. The story of Cadbury is the story of a system. The Quaker founders believed that business could be a force for good. They were right. For 100 years, Cadbury was proof. The swimming pools were real. The pensions were real. The dental care and the fruit trees and the Saturday afternoon cricket were real. The dream worked. But the dream was never protected. It was held in place by culture, by family control, by the assumption that the people running the company would continue to share the values of the people who founded it. When the family's influence faded, the culture thinned. When the culture thinned, the structure was all that was left. And the structure, a publicly listed corporation governed by shareholder primacy, was designed to do one thing: allocate capital to its highest return. It was not designed to preserve swimming pools. It was not designed to honor promises. It was not designed to care. The workers at Summerdale learned what every recipient of corporate goodwill eventually learns. The kindness of an employer is not the same as the rights of an employee. A pension granted voluntarily can be withdrawn. A factory kept open as a gesture can be closed as an economy. A promise made during a takeover can be broken in a week. Paternalism is a gift, and gifts can be revoked. George Cadbury understood this, at least in part. That is why he created the Bournville Village Trust. He gave the village a governance structure that did not depend on anyone's goodwill. He made the values permanent by writing them into the legal foundations of the institution. The trust has survived for over 120 years, not because the people running it are saints, but because its design makes it extraordinarily difficult to betray its purpose. He did not do the same for the company. Perhaps he could not have. A trust can be designed to serve a community in perpetuity. A corporation, under the rules of British company law, is ultimately the property of its shareholders, and shareholders can sell. The Cadburys protected their village, but not their company, and in that single structural choice lies the entire lesson. What survives today at Bournville is not a monument to corporate benevolence. It is proof that values only endure when they are written into governance, not entrusted to goodwill. The cottages stand because their ownership was placed beyond the reach of the market. The company fell because its ownership was not. The economic thesis of the Cadbury story is simple and uncomfortable. Ethical enterprise is possible. It can work for decades. It can transform lives. It can build villages and swimming pools and pension funds and communities that endure for a century. But within a system designed to maximize returns, ethical enterprise can only survive as long as the people in control choose to sustain it. The moment ownership passes to someone who does not share those values, and in a publicly traded company, that moment is not a possibility but a certainty, the ethics become optional. And optional ethics are no ethics at all. This is the structural impossibility at the heart of the Cadbury saga. The family proved that values and profit can coexist. They proved it with a century of evidence. But they also proved unwittingly that coexistence is not the same as permanence. Values embedded in culture are powerful but fragile. Values embedded in governance are durable. The difference is everything. The Cadbury story is not unique. It is a template. Across every industry and every country, companies built on principles face the same structural vulnerability. The founders build something meaningful. The culture carries it forward. The market tests it. And sooner or later, the market wins, unless the principles are protected by something stronger than tradition and good faith. George Cadbury's fruit trees still bloom in Bournville. The cottages still shelter families. The swimming pools, rebuilt and modernized, are still open. The playing fields still echo with weekend matches. The village he created is still, by any measure, a beautiful and functional community. He gave it away, and in giving it away, he saved it. The company he kept, the market took. In an age of shareholder capitalism, is ethical enterprise possible, or only temporarily tolerated? The answer is in Bournville. The answer is in Keynsham. The answer is in the space between a village that endures and a factory that went dark. It has always been the same answer. You can build something good, but if you want it to last, you must give it a structure stronger than a promise, because promises, in the end, are only farthings.